Hi. Okay, so I'm gonna just share some information that I learned in the past month. Um, some self-disclosure. I was groomed and coerced into being a doctor when I was growing up. So now I've decided to grow by providing education for free, the highest quality that I can. If And this is not peer reviewed or edited. I've just taken and compiled information from multiple sources on the internet. So please take with a grain of salt whatever I say. The opinions expressed by me on this channel are by my own myself. Um, if I make any like mistakes or there are any factual inaccuracies, or anything that you want to see fixed, please let me know in the comments. You know, that's pretty much it. And I'm gonna try and make this as concise, succinct as possible and as relatable to a wide audience as possible. But please do be aware that there is some like basic science comprehension and skills, and a base, foundation probably needed and required to like truly understand this material. I'm happy to answer any questions um uh regarding the stuff that I talk about. Um so without further ado, we'll get going. So first off, I have selected, oh, one last thing is there is a embedded within the slides are links to various various images and papers and studies. So I've done it as much as I can. This is, I think what's really funny is a side note as well is I saw the funniest thing today as I opened up my browser because I don't usually watch the news or listen to the news because a lot of it's just hearsay. But one of the funniest headlines I've ever seen in my life was um, Harvard refuses to comply with Trump administration demands over like anti-Semitism or something, which is like the funniest twist of irony to me, given that the Trump campaign has historically floated off of like white supremacy, uh, white supremacist sentiments in this country. So I just think it's so funny, like the way that like Harvard is like the way that the headline is worded, like refuses to comply is to insinuate that like Harvard is acting like a bratty child. I don't know. It's just oh, it's so funny. In any case, okay, let's get going. So, skeletal muscle conditions. I initially worded it as disorders, but I feel like, conditions perhaps would be a more less judgmental type of word. And then this background slide includes skeletal muscle fibers in a longitudinal fashion with round, oblong, these purple oblong shapes are nuclei. And to the best of my knowledge and from what I can discern, this is a healthy biopsy. I think it's quite beautiful, actually. I took three different muscle conditions, types, broad categories, and created a web. So everything is pretty much created. And um, I found these three categories to be particularly interesting to me. I'm not saying that I am the authority on this topic. I just made this up. I just want that to be clear. Um, like made up this categorization, but these three types of conditions do exist. I just want to make that clear. So muscular dystrophies, um, a lot of these words are based off of Greek origin words, and for example, dystrophy means um, meaning bad, difficult, or abnormal, and trophy meaning food, nourishment, growth, or development. So dystrophy is when there's an abnormal development, um, in particular pertaining to the muscles. And then myopathy, uh, in particular, I learned about a sub-classification known as mitochondrial myopathies. And those are where there's a pathological process within the muscles that originate from a defect in the mitochondria. Last but not least, we have a subclassification known as channelopathies. And this is what I have found to be particularly new and interesting for me. You go into this um, graph here, the channel subunit, ion channel, there's something wrong with how it functions or an interacting protein subunit, or perhaps somewhere else out in the space, extracellular matrix, that is interfering with the propagation of an electrochemical signal, um, being passed from, say, the neuron cell to the muscle, muscle fiber. So, again, a channelopathy is where there's something wrong with the protein um, embedded in the cell bilayer or an interacting protein associated with that, so that the flow of ions such as sodium or calcium or chloride is impeded, and that will interfere with how the electrochemical gradient is uh, propagated across cell types and creates the uh, pathological process in the muscles. Here we go. We have scientific evidence. Science is real. You wouldn't believe the amount of signs that I've seen walking around in my neighborhood saying that claim like trying to assert that science is real. It's like, yes, we know science is real, but it's kind of weird that I had to live with that. But anyway, this is evidence for mitochondria or powerhouse of the cell. And why is it named so? Is because the mitochondria takes a glucose molecule or more than one and basically through oxidative phosphorylation converts it into ATP, the energy molecule of the cell. So, if there's anything, anything I want anyone to learn from watching this, it's that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. You will learn in my classroom. You might not like what you learn, but you will learn. And you will learn that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. What else? Everyone in my class gets A's. But I'll still provide you feedback. Um, and then a nice little pictograph to help you remember what the meaning is. I've included is a picture of Raichu, Pikachu, and Pichu. They're the electric pocket monsters. So energy. Think in terms of energy. The mitochondria is kind of like the engine of the cell, so to speak. I think I remember watching or finding a particular guy named Dylan Petkus who specialized in something related to that a long time ago. But anyway, so this is kind of like a few, more than a few, but a lot of different ways to look at understanding a disease. And the way that I remember prevalence, we'll start with this is like prevalence is there's a prevalence P point in time, and then it's a number of cases at a given point in time. Incidence is a number, excuse me, of new cases over a given interval of time. Demographics and epidemiology. So this will translate over into the sector of public health. Severity of disease, so like a spectrum of from mild to severe. Social psych, the relationship with self and to others. Environment context, and by that I mean like environmental toxins. So for in the case of famous case of Erin Brockovich, where she brought awareness to was it hexachromium contaminants in the water supply from PG&E, made famous by the film Erin Brockovich. Yeah, physiology, pathology, pathophysiology, and genetics, which is going to be very important in the example that I'm going to give later. So I sort of boiled down for you a general idea of how to make sense of clinical presentation of a person. And I'm using the SOAP. So, subjective, how is the person feeling? So asking open-ended questions can help glean more comprehensive answers. Um, so this is a very important technique in interviewing someone. And I don't mean just in the clinical setting, but in any kind of situation. So, like for example, in my reality, I've been very concerned with the mental health of the people I've been coming across because a lot of them have been asking, especially who are working in like nonprofit work, a lot of or they've been asking a lot of closed-ended questions like do you, are you? I don't know why they're asking questions like this, but it's I wonder it has something to do with their upbringing or their training or lack thereof, lack of education. It's like unclear to me, but please try to ask more open-ended questions. Um, Also another helpful technique is to, wait for the other person to talk. You'll be surprised at like just staying quiet and hearing what someone else has to say will tell you the answers. They will tell you. And be sure to ask with the energy of trying to help, not to interrogate. Um, like this isn't, let's try not to make this the Spanish Inquisition. Objectively vitals, physical signs, and or symptoms. Try to go from order from head to toe. Labs, blood work, biopsies, graphs and grams. Imaging, are there other relevant objective data measurements? So on and so forth. So, moving on to assessments part of the SOAP note, diagnostics. Bingo! It can be very, very satisfying to get your um, diagnostic hypotheses or your guess correct. And it's a whole field of like thinking about of data collection and let's get data collection, sensitivity versus specificity, accuracy and precision, history, physical exam, labs and imaging. And again, history taking, generally what a person will tell you about their history can be extremely helpful and they'll just tell you what the diagnosis is without even needing to take measurements. Um, or sometimes they even like do their own research and they will just straight up tell you what their diagnosis is. Um, Again, in order to be thorough, you have to consider like objective markers as well. But oftentimes, I have found in my experience that like a really good history taking process will give you the answer. Um, Also, I try not to call people unreliable historians. I think that is sort of a negative bias because pretty much everyone is an unreliable historian. If you look at numerous like eyewitness court testimonies and all those kinds of things, it is normal. It is normal for someone to not remember every single detail of their life, or their medical history records. So just be aware of that. So try to be prepared for the worst, but expect the best of people. Um, and I highly recommend the popular science book, Brain Bugs: How the Brain's Flaws Shape Our Lives by Dean Buonamano, which is a book that is written intended for a popular science kind of lens, a general audience. Um, Anyone with like a high school reading level English um, GED can read it fine, I would say. So, in terms of treatments, I would say like most importantly, have your heart in mind in the right place. So have them coherent. Just being purely intellectual, you're not going always going to get the right uh connect with somebody. And if you're just thinking with your feelings, you might be um you might miss objectivity. So try to balance both here. Um, Treatment management can be challenging, but it is very important to consider that one, life is not a standardized test. Um, it can be complicated and unfortunately, it can be hard because one is one has to remember to separate what one learns in theory, um, say through standardized testing, and understand that the real life, real world doesn't always, it's not always congruent. Um, Also be aware of values of somebody. How well does the treatment plan fit through the overall context of their life? You can use motivational interviewing techniques. Um, and success can mean different things to different people. So try to clarify what success means. And this can change at any time. It's like there's no like a right or wrong answer, it's moral judgment. Sometimes part of treatment plan is just to do nothing, and that's completely fine. Like doing nothing, giving someone the time, space, and time to heal is is perfectly valid, depending on the situation, of course. Um, Again, yes, what I was taught, but this is not always necessarily like always correct, is to go from like the least severe to like most severe, if there is a problem. If there is a problem. So lifestyle, habits, prayer, meditation, occupation, social community engagement. In occupation, it's just like anything that keeps someone occupied or busy. So it doesn't have to be like a paid job. It's just like keeps them focused on something that someone enjoys. So it could be like it could be anything from like being a garbage person, or not a garbage person, but like someone who takes out the garbage, to like painting, coloring, doing research, whatever, keeps them occupied. And, even people who like retire find that they get bored, so they have to keep their minds and hearts and bodies occupied with something. Um, as people like, for example, when people climb up the corporate ladder, maybe in many cases, but not always, but many or some cases, like their level of responsibilities will may or may not. So in the cases where they actually decrease as they go up the ladder, where they're given less responsibility and they're getting paid more, they might find that they get bored more easily. Um, so they might fill up their time with other kinds of activities. So it really depends. And then having a spiritual practice or life. So like individual prayer, meditation, having social community engagement. So like regularly going to church with other people, those kinds of things. Farms. So over the counter, external consumables, sprays, bandages, things that are topicals, all those kinds of things. Also like the more uh, invasive kinds of procedures, including surgery and interventional and non-invasive techniques. Um, that being said, now we have like a general scaffold or framework. Let us rest and recline into a potential real world scenario. We're giving thanks to Fancy Pooh Bear. Like an old meme from my younger student days. And we're taking Steinert's disease as our example, aka Hirschman-Steinert syndrome, aka myotonic muscular dystrophy type 1 DM. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to stay away from this uh, classification because it's just so wordy and I don't want to get confused with type 1 diabetes mellitus. Um, okay. So I've created this online art gallery, historically based, of Hans Gustav Wilhelm Steinert, German neurologist. So he collected some data from patients he found with who had pathological changes and characteristics consistent with a classic pattern of myotonia and multi-organ system involved. And so if you want to get super fancy and academic, you can use the term Hirschman-Steinert syndrome. Reason being, so Steinert used to work for Hirschman back in the day. And then Kirschman had a son, also named Kirschman, obviously, who continued the work of Steinert. So the son is who is credited here in this nomenclature. That's more the sources are linked there. So, okay. So in terms of generally understanding a disease, and kind of applying that as a template or scaffold into the context of Steinert's. So, incidence, prevalence, demographics, epidemiology. It is the most common type of muscular dystrophy found in adults of European ancestry, often appearing to be diagnosed in early 20s. Now, there is congenital form of Steinert's and non-congenital form. Congenital meaning to be born with, and non-congenital meaning this what's described here appearing later in life. Um, Severities can vary from mild to severe. Social psych can lead to some anxiety, depression, fatigue, to name a few. Environment context depends. Pathophysiology. So it is a multi-organ system involved complex syndrome. So there's a particular pattern of cognitive um, complaints. So things related to the central nervous system with regards to like sleepiness, um, in particular, in the eyes, cataracts, um, with regards to the heart, arrhythmias. There's GI palm involvement. In terms of endocrine and reproductive, there can be some insulin dysregulation, testicular, and or like reproductive. It can get complicated with LGBTQIA stuff, so I'm just gonna list out what I found here. But like testicular atrophy, thyroid and calcium balance, and then obviously the titular muscular skeletal myotonia. What we have, uh, what's great, what we know is that it is actually caused by an abnormal trinucleotide CTG repeat sequence within chromosome 19, where at the gene DMPK CHR 19Q13.3. This is where genetics is really important for a particular disease or syndrome. So, what do I mean by CT repeat? So, within the genetic code of an organism, there are nucleotides. And on chromosome 19 of the human genome, there is a sequence, CTG, 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 that is um, abnormally expanded. So there's just too many CTGs and it's unstable. So that we have determined to be the cause of why all of these things are happening. Um, and this is passed down in an autosomal dominant fashion. So it can be quite common. It's like a 50% chance that if the parent has it, their kid will have it. So I believe that's correct. Autosomal dominant inheritance percentage. Yeah, that's right. Okay. And what's particularly um important in terms of like genetic counseling and to know is the feature of anticipation. So what that means is that the progeny or the child who has Steinert's, who has inherited it from their parent, will experience it earlier in life than their parent did, and with more severe features, symptomology. That's anticipation. And what I also learned, interestingly enough, is that someone with a congenital form will almost always inherit the mutant DMPK allele from the mom. That was interesting. Okay, so in terms of clinical presentation, this is this is what I've compiled based on what I know. This is like a picture of knitters that I found that I've sourced as well as some other case studies. Um, so here we're gonna work our way through from kind of the top um to the bottom as much as we can. It's not perfect. Again, it's variable, it's a varying clinical presentation. How's the person feeling? Neuropsychologically, school performance, or impairment may be noted. It may be, and there may be some mood disorders, sleep-related complaints. So there might be some daytime sleep disorders observed, sleepy during the day, GI complaints. Vitals. So in particular, the pulse will be affected. So we look at the Muscular Dystrophy Association. Um, it's Dr. Grow, I believe. Where did he? Um, okay, here we go. Cardiac disease is nearly always conduction disturbance, resulting from gradual replacement of the heart's conductive tissue with scar tissue, a process known as cardiac fibrosis. So there's a fibrosing, a scarring of um, the heart's cardiac muscle, it becomes scarred over time. And so when that muscle becomes scarred, the electrical signals cannot pass through and create that normal sinus rhythm when you get arrhythmias. Hence, the pulse may be affected. Um, okay, and then head, we have frontal balding, frontoparietal alopecia, weakness, atrophy of facial muscles, upper lip in an uninverted V, leaving the mouth partly open. So, like, kind of like this, like that. Um, Cataracts is also can be seen. So on slit lamp examination, posterior subcapsular cataracts detectable as red and green iridescent opacities. That's a possible finding. I personally don't really know too much about slit lamp exams. I just know that they exist, and this is like something that I found online. And yeah, ptosis is when the eyelids are kind of droopy, um, due to the musculoskeletal weakness. What you can also see is swan neck appearance. So it'll appear elongated and thin due to sternocleidomastoid muscle wasting. You can see here. Okay. Um, Musculoskeletal generalized muscle atrophy. There will be distal muscle weakness. So two signs, very, very obvious to see signs, can be grip myotonia. So that is when it's hard for um, sort of clenched muscles to unclench, as seen here. And then a foot drop, which there's a demo later in this presentation. Also, scoliosis, cervical lordosis may be observed as well. And cervical lordosis may be because of the sternocleidomastoid weakening. So we have this like sign of grip myotonia and then a foot drop. I thought this was a really cool video. This isn't myotonia, but this is just two examples of foot drop.
Foot drop is the inability to flex the ankle. This man has right leg weakness and numbness from nerve impingement in the lower back. When walking, he lifts his knee higher than normal to avoid dragging his toes. The foot then slaps on the floor with each step. This is an example of steppage gait. Foot drop can also occur after a stroke. This woman has left-sided hemibody weakness. When walking, she compensates by hiking up her hip and knee in order to clear the foot over the floor. However, walking in this manner can cause back and hip pain. When wearing an ankle-foot brace, her gait is more normal. To learn more about foot drop, see our Q&A.
So I thought that was a really two really good examples showing what foot drop can look like. And I also appreciate how they showed what the gait looks like when there's an orthotic there. Um, okay, so in terms of diagnostics, in addition to history, physical exam, the modern gold standard, from what I know, what I've gleaned, is genetic testing to confirm diagnosis. Historically, long ago, muscle biopsy was used, and then slip lamp exam was a particularly sensitive sign, um, which helps rule in something sensitive. Other helpful clinical diagnostic studies have been electromyography, which almost always shows myotonia. And here I'm show there is a recording of myotonia shown as a waxing and a waning kind of sound, you'll see the amplitude of the signal wax and wane. If I can get it to play. There we go.
Hear this signature sound with waxing and waning with exceedingly fast frequency of discharges, maxing at around 150 Hertz. In addition, the background interference pattern is full with minimal effort, typical of a severe underlying myopathy. I hope you found this.
He's very professional. Okay. And then slit lamp exam. So that appears to be the posterior subcapsular cataract finding. I don't really know. I'm not an ophthalmologist or optometrist, but could be interesting. Um, and I also can't really can't really tell like what was the cataract finding. I think it might have been the sort of like like irregularity, perhaps. Like that jagged line. Maybe. Maybe. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Labs. So it may have mildly elevated serum CK. That makes sense because CK is an enzyme marker for damaged muscle tissue. Um, so it's so if muscle is damaged, the enzyme CK can leak out and then into the blood, and then the labs measuring the blood will see CK serum levels elevated. Endocrine, you can check a baseline annual fasting of blood glucose, HbA1c, possible hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, thyroid, PTH, reproductive labs, liver enzymes, LFTs, lipid panel, vitamin D, adrenals. Um, and then imaging, relevant imaging can include brain PET MRI, electrocardiogram, electromyography, muscle biopsy, and other relevant X-ray MRI. So treatments can include, but we're not limiting it to, eyes, cataract surgery, heart, pacemaker to help treat arrhythmia, endocrine. This is an example. I'm not saying this is like best practice or standard practice. Just an example. Jardiance, Empag, gliflozin. There are contraindications. This is a link to the drug manufacturer's website. Um, and then for the muscles, various types of physical therapy related stuff. This one has a really cool regimen or a really detailed um, kind of chapter on treating it or managing it rather. Um, and then social psych, having a life, socializing, support networks, having a sense of purpose, activities, community, hobbies, interests. I think this is just generally good for like anyone. Definitely helpful for me at least. Hope for a cure. Yes, there is hope. Research is being done. More details on the following slides. Anesthesia, please be extremely careful. And this is just from what I've read. I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert. This is just my own. I'm not I'm not pretending to be an expert. This is just what I've learned like just a very okay. Um, let's see. So Victor, good old Victor. So he has some notes for us. So in terms of anesthesia should be used only when it cannot be avoided. So depolarizing relaxants and anticholinesterases may increase myotonia. Sedatives, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, opiates may exacerbate ventilatory drive abnormalities, apnea. Bracelet that identifies patient as having DM may be helpful. Um, yeah. So like potential like research, I would say the most promising is or potentially is CRISPR-Cas9. And this is just a screenshot of a comment I found in an Ask Reddit thread about science advancements in the last few years. Talking about induced stem cells, but I don't really know much about CRISPR-Cas9 research, but I know it was like a new technology that was introduced when the last time I was doing basic science research at this kind of level of rigor. And it's sort of like a cut and paste gene editing method. And there are like so some approaches can involve like kind of cutting and pasting, silencing, and then the third one that's interesting is inserting an, an additional signal upstream. So like if the code is read from like for example like left to right, or they would say like 3 prime to 5 prime or 5 prime to 3 prime. Um like say left to right, then we put a signal more left or an additional snippet of code more left of the CTG sequence, the beginning of the CTG sequence, and that can eliminate um, the copies that are made of this DNA sequence. And I believe that's probably because it having that foreign piece of code will interrupt whatever is reading it or maybe processing it in some way. And then here are like delivery modes proposed and challenges. So yes, there is hope, but we have to be like aware of like potential risks that can happen in terms of um doing exploratory work. Okay, so and then last but not least, in terms of treatment, kind of going into like epigenetic research territory, Dr. Joe Dispenza. So he, from what I understand, is a very like spiritually gifted person, and and he has done like scientific work, and I believe like what he says is valid. And there is true, like having a very strong sense of like purpose and alignment of heart and mind coherence patterns, electricity can bring about, can help elevate and augment the body's natural healing processes. So when someone says like mind over matter, it's a very powerful force. For example, I when I was younger, when I would get like a tickle in my throat, I remember thinking like, oh, it's fine. I'll just like it'll go away. And usually it does go away. Like, and then some other people might be a bit more hypochondriatic and say like, "Oh my God, like I'm gonna get sick," and then they get more sick. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. But like when I've always tried to believe like I'm healthy and I have a very strong immune system and tends to work out pretty well. So could be a confirmatory bias sort of thing, but there's a reason why a lot of people like have benefited from his meditations and his research. And so yeah, I just wanted to put that out there that, you know, um there's genetics and then there's epigenetics. There's a lot of different options out there in the universe. No need to worry unless you have to worry. Okay. Uh, I rambled on long enough. So this is like a section dedicated for like quiet period practice problem solving. And I've created some practice questions and just for anyone who like wants them. These are meant to be fun and please refrain from doing them if it makes you feel sad or someone is peer pressuring you into doing them. So like here we have Rihanna going no 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 and this guy with a mustachio going no no no. Grandpa going no no no, baby going no 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 no. So please, this is for fun. Please don't get mad. Okay. So here's what I've created in this speaker notes section here. 5 multiple choice, 3 short answer, 2 long answer, discussion questions. And I will come up with the answer key for next week's video, next Tuesday. I'll release that and hopefully also link it to a post. Boop, 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 boop. Okay. Okay. So here is the point prevalence problem. Special thanks to all of these people who have with me. Have not included a lot of other people because just for the sake of space and anonymity. Um, yeah. Okay. Some further notes include regarding healthcare delivery systems from a business managerial standpoint, just from like what I've been taught and learned. I'm just saying. So, like recently, I received a very concerning notice on Medi-Cal benefits being available in either fee-for-service versus managed care. If it were me, I would avoid fee-for-service like the plague. I would go for managed care. Fee-for-service, this is a generalization though. Like, I'm not saying in all cases this is true, but in general, this type of traditional fee structure incentivizes caregivers to go for volume, so quantity over quality of care. So you can imagine how that might end up for you. So ideally, I would recommend a sweet spot of quality and quantity for maximum value of service slash products. So I remember I'm laughing because in middle school, there's this memory of in my math class, my seventh grade math class, teacher was trying to make us do these Scantron problems, and then this one kid was like rebelling, so he just starts ripping through them like as fast as possible. And she's like, "What are you doing? You're not even reading the problem." He's like, and he goes, "It's about quantity, not quality." And it's just she's going nuts. I just thought it was really funny. Um, it's really funny. But yes, overall, I would recommend managed care over fee for service. Okay. And then two is this like case or executive report um from Brandeis on Shouldice Hospital hernia surgery repair. And this is just to like help encourage critical thinking about this case because you will know that they have a disclosure. It's like on how it's like written about how amazing it is, and then here it says um these people who like for their generosity and hospitality, their research would not have been possible without their transparency and willingness to spend time with us. So obviously there's like influence from these people like telling them like this is how this is how we do things. But, you know, it's it works for a certain clientele and it's a very specialized type of service. But we have some important lessons here. Put people first, emphasize relationships, relationship building. So that's like a key component of like culture, right? Is when you put the person first. And this is something I learned in one of my favorite case studies was Southwest Airlines is like kind of their idea, it's like customers first, right? Customer service, and then standardization of procedures, and then team building. And so designing patient customer experience, how would you feel? How do you want the person you're serving to feel? What is the most pleasant customer service experience you have ever had? And then why? Like, what did they do? What did they say? What, how did they, how was their, how did they create the ambiance? And then so lastly, what are your thoughts on this case study? Is Shoalice really the best? It's like obviously no, but they were the best in terms of serving their population um population's needs at the time. And you know, just because they did really, really well before this or up until this case executive study doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be as successful in the future. Who knows? I mean, you know, it depends like the people the surgeons who were doing the work, I'm sure, and the people involved that their expertise is very to that person. So if they become older and they retire and move on, does that mean that the quality of the care suffers? Um, all right. And then last but not least is this Kinefin frameworks that I found for leadership that I found very, very interesting and helpful and intriguing. And one quotation that I found is a major mistake that organizations make is to impose a best practice in a good practice domain. So, that quotation or that what he says in this video, is it Dave Snowden? Um, a major mistake that organizations make is to impose best practice in a good practice domain. Um, is really important. I think it's kind of to get away from sort of like, and it's trying to make, if you're thinking from a managerial standpoint, like, how do you make these tough decisions when it seems like you have a lot of data in front of you and things seem, um, and you're still trying to make sense of it. So, without further ado, let's just play.
Nevin is a sense-making framework. It's not a model, and that's actually quite an important distinction. A model seeks to represent reality. A framework is a way of looking at reality. So Cynefin is a framework. It has 5 domains, all right? It's drawn with a series of curved lines. It's fairly easy to do. And it also picks up on the original 3 types of system: ordered systems, complex, and chaotic systems. But what it does is divide order into 2 and adds a 5th domain of disorder. Now I'll start with disorder, then run around the others. So disorder, at the center of the framework, is the state of not knowing what type of system you're in. Now, when we first create Cynefin within an organizational context, this is often the biggest domain, because people aren't used to an ontologically diverse approach to sense making. They're used to single ontology, not multi-ontology. So basically, disorder is the state of not knowing, are you ordered, are you complex, or are you chaotic? Dependent on your own personal preference, your own personal history, you'll tend to assess the situation based on your own preference for action. Bureaucrats, for example, generally assess problems as failures of process or assess the need for new process. Experts generally assume they didn't have enough time to do the investigation. Politicians are pretty good at complex. They get lots of people from different backgrounds and look at different possibilities. And of course, the fascists love a crisis because then they can be given absolute power to tell everybody else what to do. There's a reality on the cognitive science front that we assess a situation based on how we've already decided to act, which is why an awful lot of Cynefin techniques are about preventing you from having any knowledge of action when you do situational assessment or any opportunity to divide it. Either way, disorder is an unhappy place. It's a state of being ontologically ignorant. It's a state of not knowing what type of system you're in. Therefore, you're likely to get things very wrong. It's not the same thing as a chaotic system. In a chaotic system, there is no possibility of order. In a disordered system, it may be ordered, you just don't realize it. Right? So that's the criticality of disorder. Order divides into 2, obvious and complicated. Now, in ordered systems, there is a linear relationship between cause and effect. The same thing will happen again the same way twice, and not by accident, but by the nature of the system. The difference between obvious and complicated is that in obvious, everybody can see what the relationship is, and nobody disputes it. So in the United Kingdom, for example, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. In the United States, they drive on the right-hand side of the road. There are historical reasons why this happened, but nobody really disputes it anymore. You don't drive on the right in the UK or on the left in the US. You accept it's in the, the UK is in the category of countries that drive on the left, so you change your behavior accordingly. So the decision model is sense, categorize, respond. Yeah, which country am I in? Okay, it's the UK, that falls into the category of countries which drive on the left. Right, I'll drive on the left. Nice and simple. It's standard operating procedures, doctrine in the army, it's a good space. Over constrain it, you get the collapse into chaos. Because actually you're creating a constraint which is impossible. To pursue the metaphor a bit, if you said you must never ever drive on the right-hand side of the road in the UK, then that means if a child runs on the road in front of you, you should kill them rather than avoid them. And that's obviously a nonsense, all right? So even the most rigid systems allow for exceptions, or at least they should do if they're properly constructed. In the complicated domain, however, here it's not self-evident other than possibly to experts. So if you have deep expertise in the field as an advisor, for you it may be obvious, but for the decision maker it's complicated. They know there is a solution. They know you probably know it, but you still have to convince them of your expertise. Now that may be in a high trust situation, just telling them. It may be doing analysis, it may be doing investigation. The decision model in a complicated domain is to sense, analyze, respond. So I gather incoming data, I analyze it, that tells me what to do, or tells me who to call in to tell me what to do. And whereas in an obvious domain, I can apply best practice as one right way of doing things, in a complicated domain, I apply good practice. There are different variations dependent a little bit on context. And a major mistake that organizations make is to actually impose best practice in a good practice domain. Doctors, for example, know that there are variations which in exceptional circumstances they would take. Force them to only adopt one approach is a major mistake. You need some degree of variation in the system. Now, there is actually an interesting related problem here. Experts can be trusted within the bounds of their expertise if the situation is complicated, but in a complex domain, they only create hypotheses. And the danger is a lot of hypotheses are wrong. Nothing wrong with that. It's the nature of the system. The trouble is, if we believe a complex system is complicated and the expert gets it wrong, we lose trust in expertise. So the boundary between complicated and complex is important because on one side of the boundary, somebody with the right training, the right qualification can be trusted. On the other side of the boundary, they can't. Again, take a medical situation. In single morbidity situations, one expert may know everything. In multi-morbidity situations, you've got all sorts of interacting elements. It may be more complex. It may actually require a different approach, a multi-team approach, for example. So, ordered systems, obvious and complicated, sense, categorize, respond, or sense, analyze, respond, apply best practice or apply good practice. And coming back to our theme of constraints, in an obvious domain, I have rigid or fixed constraints. In a complicated domain, I have governing constraints, i.e. the boundaries are defined, but within the boundaries, within the containment, a greater degree of variation is allowed. In the complex world, well, here it's multi-modular, there's no linear relationship between cause and effect. I don't know what the right solution is until I act. So the decision model is probe, sense, respond. If I think the situation is complex, and remember the heuristic, the evidence supports conflicting hypotheses that can't be resolved within an acceptable timescale, then I test or search out ideas which are coherent and ideas for action which are coherent, and I run parallel safe-to-fail experiments, and the experiments reveal what's possible. In a complex world, everything I do changes the situation. So a diagnostic is an intervention, and an intervention is a diagnostic. Now, what generally happens is the experiments merge, mutate, and change. It's less that one succeeds or one fails, but in combination, they change the space so that things are easier to manage. So the complex world, probe, sense, respond, and the practice is emergent or it's exadaptive, something we're going to deal with later in the course. Another way of describing acceptation is radical repurposing. So, for example, I have found many things I can repurpose to open a beer bottle in a hotel bar late at night when I haven't got a proper opener. Yeah, repurposing is something human beings are good at. And in biology, that's called acceptation. So in a complex world, we generally discover novelty through repurposing existing capability. So we don't apply best practice or good practice. Practice is emergent, it's exadaptive. In a chaotic domain, on the other hand, there is no pattern. There are no constraints. There are zero constraints. Everything is all over the place. So my first action is to create a constraint. Or if I want to move things into the complex, into the chaotic domain, I get rid of the constraints. And the irony is that may require creating a container. It's kind of like a sandpit, all right, a skunkworks project. I hide this thing away and I remove all of the constraints, but I protect it. Yeah? We'll talk about distributed decision support in a different module. But in a chaotic system, there are no constraints, which means I will get complete novelty. But I act, I don't analyze, I don't probe, I don't categorize. I act, sense, respond. Yeah? Now, the boundary between order and chaos is shown as a cliff in Cynefin. The reason for that is if I over-constrain a system which can't naturally be constrained, I move to that boundary zone, also known as a zone of complacency, and then I have this catastrophic failure. And the trouble is when I fall over the cliff, it takes very little energy to fall off a cliff, but it takes a lot of energy to climb back up it. So it's something you should try and avoid. Yeah. The final distinction here is between enabling constraints and governing constraints. This is the complex, complicated divide. So say a governing constraint contains what we do. It's like a series of rules or principles. Yeah, well, less principles, more rules. An enabling constraint is something like a heuristic, a rule of thumb. Now, this approach revolutionized warfare at the time of Napoleon. He created a very simple heuristic, march to the sound of the guns. Until Napoleon, people basically waited for commands which came from the general who sat on a hill on a horse and sent out runners, or individual commanders took autonomous action and hoped they got away with it. Napoleon created a heuristic, and the heuristic in this context is measurable march to the sound of the guns. That means there was a guiding principle you had to follow, but you need other people would follow the same principle, so the system had self-organizing capability. With the US Marines, they have 3: capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep moving. Now, these are called enabling constraints. Yeah? And the way you manage a complex world is by discovering the enabling constraints which naturally exist within people's day-to-day narratives, codify them, attach them to teaching stories, and as long as people follow the constraint, the heuristic, then they're allowed to make mistakes, because mistakes are inevitable if a situation is complex. Yeah. Now, again, we're going to come back to that in a separate module, which will look at heuristic management and the boundary between heuristics and rules. But for the moment, it's a key distinction with the Cynefin. Fixed constraints, governing constraints, enabling constraints, no constraints. Best practice, good practice, emergent or examptive practice, novel practice. Dependent on the situation you're in, you make decisions in a different way, you assess the situation in a different way, you handle contingency and risk in a radically different way. Cynefins' huge originality is it doesn't seek to replace what went before, it seeks to create boundaries around it and create space for novelty on the other side of those boundaries.
Okay. So that was a lot, but I hope it provided a framework for understanding how to make sense of different sensory data. It was very interesting for me. Um, and so I've come up with an essay prompt for anybody who wants it. For me personally, I think I'll just share an example. So like in terms of, excuse me, getting acquainted with gardening, I felt was very similar to like initially like a chaotic domain. And at first, like I had to figure out like how to set the boundaries within a certain space that was just completely undeveloped. And then continue to create more boundaries in that thing, in that space. And then how to create or create constraints, and then how to think about creating like adaptable constraints versus fixed constraints. It's like a very interesting sort of thing to play with, and like I don't know, just like thinking in terms of like that abstract manner in terms of a project and having creative oversight over a project has just been very um has been very interesting. An interesting kind of learning process. And then I've personally experienced what it's like to feel as though um from someone on the receiving end of like where an organization attempts to create so much order, obvious order that collapses into chaos. It's like it's not fun. It's very hard to like recover from that. I'm sure a lot of people have experienced this as well. Um, and it can be very, very challenging, like he says, to like jump off that cliff. I'm not saying it can't be done. Like you can always, it's kind of like what I would do is like kind of like draw arrows around his like framework is like you can kind of like go through different areas of the quadrant maybe, but still very interesting. Okay, last but not least, some music. Um, I really liked Bigger Than My Body by John Mayer, and I think kind of alludes to this sense of like, your soul wanting some like yearning or knowing that it's meant for more. And I think if you feel like that's feels true to you, it probably is. And like you're still like tapping into your potential and your purpose in life. And I loved this song when I was a child. I think I like would listen to it when I was like heard it on his website. It was gorgeously designed, and interactive, with like a dark blue background. When I was like 8 years old. I kind of miss websites like that, you know? And then this film, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Um, one of my neuroscience professors was like alluding to it in a lecture, I remember, because he was making a point that one of the most neuroprotective mechanisms of not remembering things perfectly, that the reason why the brain remembers things incorrectly is a protective mechanism against PTSD, potentially. This is his idea or hypothesis or assertion that so that you don't always feel the unique pain of that hurtful memory that you've experienced. And because of the way that he framed that sentiment, I was kind of scared to watched this movie for a long time, but when I actually watched it within the past month, I was so charmed by it. I was so charmed. I loved the movie and I loved the way it ended, how the couple grew and evolved throughout their sort of turbulent relationship um with each other, and they really both wanted to make things work. And so they did. And that's like the power of love. No matter what happens in the past, there's like a true desire for two people to come together. It will happen, you know? It's such a nice note. Same. Oh boy. Love. Always gotta end on love. It's one of the most poetic videos. Is I don't know how to pronounce his name. Slavoj Zizek? I don't know. It's like you love someone through the trash.
Because what is love? Love is not idealization. Every true lover knows that if you really love a woman or a man, that you don't idealize him or her. Love means that you accept a person with all its failures, stupidities, ugly points, and nonetheless, the person is absolute for you. Everything life that makes life worth living, but you see perfection in imperfection itself, and that's how we should learn to love the world. True ecologist loves all this.
You love someone through the trash. You love someone through the trash. Okay. If you made it to the end of this really long ass video, thank you for watching.